Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Colin's Code. Today, we're going to be talking about instant messengers and what they would look like in the 80s and the 90s, and the constraints behind these instant messengers during such times. Um, so, let me first define an instant messenger. It's a real time chat client that uses the internet to send messages, right? So, different than SMS and obviously phone calls because it's a text-based chat client. Um, and some typical ones that we use today are mostly primarily in the U.S. Facebook Messenger, in other countries WhatsApp, and in China they frequently use WeChat. Um, so what I imagine an instant messenger in the 80s would look like is a command line prompt, like this here, where you can send a message to someone if you have their server domain, or I mean not their server domain, the domain of their machine, or the IP address of their computer. Um, so that's how I imagine what it would look like in the 80s, just basically a command line prompt. So the constraints that would come with this are you need to know the IP address or the domain name of that user, right? So you're going to have to pre-exchange the domain name or the IP address with the user that you want to talk to. Um, and user messages would not be private. Encryption wouldn't be included in such protocols. So if somebody's tapping into the wire or switch, router, whatever it is, they can read your messages that are going over that wire. Okay. If users aren't familiar with the command line, they won't be able to use this tool, right? Because it's based primarily on the command line, because we don't really have web applications and many graphical user interface applications at the time. Okay, and users could only message one person at a time. Because they're sending directly to that IP address. It's peer-to-peer, so it's not using the client-server-based architecture. You're not hitting a server. It's actually peer-to-peer, so you're just messaging, another person just based on their IP address or their domain. So that's basically how I imagine and picture instant messaging in the 80s. Now let's talk about the 90s. So with technology, there's always improvements, right? Let's see if this loads. Hold on. Okay, there we go. Like I was saying, there's a principle called Moore's Law, which means technology is always improving. Every 2 years, certain transistors improve 2 times or whatever. But the basis of this law is that technology improves over time, right? So in the 1990s, the first web browser was created, and GUI applications and GUI interfaces, Windows, Mac OS started to become popular. So I imagine an instant messaging system either based off of a graphical user interface program, like so here, or a web-based application, right, using a browser. Okay, like I said, here's more of a modern one, but yeah, let's just imagine that we have a GUI application or a web-based application. Okay, so this kind of implements my assumptions, implements the client server architecture, where you have a server, which is a computer that is always running, and you have a set of clients that are going to be connecting to the server, using this server for your instant messaging program, right? So there's a constraint that comes with this is one, um, if this server cannot take the high amounts of traffic, the server is going to crash, or the message time, the sending and receiving time is going to be extremely slow, right? So if you have a server that only takes 30 users, and can only handle 30 users, we're going to have an issue when we get 100 users on there, right? And this eliminates the peer-to-peer connections, right? So we're using the client-server architecture, um, and you are required to know the username that you're going to want to chat to, right? So if I want to chat to Joe Smith, I need to know Joe Smith's username. So I'm going to have to pre-establish that with Joe Smith. I'm going to have to call him and say, yeah, what's your username for IM? And he'll come back to you and say, okay, here's your username. So you need to know the username. There's constraints on the traffic and the speeds. And then another thing is encryption. HTTPS wasn't invented until 1995. So once again, messages and traffic over the wire can be read by others, right? So if somebody's sitting at a switch in the middle of you and Joe Smith, they can read all the messages going from you to Joe Smith. So that's another big constraint on the application. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have for talking about accessible design and the constraints on applications in the 80s and the 90s and what I imagine what an instant messenger would look like in the 80s and 90s. So thank you for watching, and I'm out. Peace.